Today I will show you how to build a daily news brief service that is going to call News API, get back a bunch of news articles, and then we're going to use a locally running large language model to summarize these news and send them back to our user. We can either send back an HTML response or JSON. Let's look at this diagram a bit more in detail to see what we're going to be building. We'll get a request coming to our Springboot service. I called it Daily Brief Service. This is going to then call News API, which is a public API that we can call and get back all the articles for a specific date, country, and etc. So I will show you how to use this. You are free to use any news API you can find. I found this to be quite good because it offers free API calls if you're developing. As long as you're just building a portfolio project, this should be fine. Another interesting thing to notice is this block here in the middle. We'll add the chance to have a render endpoint, and if the user calls this render endpoint, we want to send back HTML. And the interesting part is that this HTML will be generated by our AI model running on our machine. Otherwise, we'll just send back this response as JSON. Once we get the news articles, we'll send them to our locally running AI model. In this case, we're going to be using Mistral. So Mistral AI is a LLM, large language model, and I chose this because apparently it's supposed to be quite good at summarizing English. So I thought, why not try with this one? And we will be running Mistral inside Ollama. Ollama is a service. We can say it's kind of a container for AI models. So it's quite powerful as it allows us to run AI models locally. And then we can call these AI models using API endpoints. So we will be using that feature. So this is the system we're going to be building today. I think it's a great portfolio project, and you can get ideas to extend maybe a pre-existing project you worked on, or you can take this as a base and then add your own extensions. Before writing code, let's have a look at the components we're going to be using to build this whole system. I talked about News API. Basically, you will need to visit newsapi.org, and this is what you will be shown. And on here, you will need to get an API key, for which you need to actually create an account. The account is free, they don't ask any credit card information or anything like that. Once you have created your own account, you will be shown this page, and over here you've got your API key. I suggest you don't share it with anyone. This is what we're going to need to call this API service. As you can see, because we're just developing, we can use this free tier. You don't need to pay. And we get 1,000 requests, I believe, for 24 hours, which is quite good, and they are more than enough for us testing locally and building a personal project. As you can see from this graph, I have already run some tests, and it shows you your usage. So once we've got the API key, just save it somewhere. We are going to need this later. The next thing you need is Mistral AI running on your local machine. And as I said, for that, we're going to be using Ollama. It's quite easy. You just need to go on ollama.com and download this on your machine. I used Brew to install it. So once you have installed it, just run it on your terminal. So if you have used Brew to install it, you can use this command to run Ollama. And once you run it, leave this terminal running, or you can even try to run it in detached mode. So you don't need an extra terminal. If you see this, you can see that Ollama is running on this port over here on our local machine, 11434. We will need this port later when we're going to be calling Mistral AI inside Ollama using the API endpoints. So Ollama is running. Now we can run some commands to see what we have on Ollama. So if you do Ollama list, you will see nothing if this is the first time you're running this. As you can see, I've already downloaded 2 AI models, Mistral 7B and DeepSeek Coder. So I will be running Mistral 7B on my local machine, and I will leave this running in the background. So when we call Ollama on its endpoint, it will send the request to the locally running instance of Mistral. So you can even directly ask questions here. For example, who are you? And as you can see, the model is running on your own machine, and this is generating answers live from your machine, so you don't need an internet connection. Okay, so we've got Ollama, we've got Mistral AI running on our machine. Now let's take a quick look at Mistral. So as I said, Mistral AI is a large language model that is supposed to be good for summarizing English text. I did some quick research online, and this is what came up. It's quite lightweight as well to run on your own machine, so I decided to go for this. And another thing, if you go on Ollama and you search for a specific model, so in this case Mistral, you can see the options. There are many options for different kind of versions of Mistral AI. Depending on the data points, they're going to have different sizes. I just went for the first one. You can take a look at the other ones. And it also gives you the command that you need to run to download this model on your machine and run it. So if you run Ollama run Mistral 7b, this is going to both download and then run this AI model on your machine. So once you've done that, we now need to create a Springboot project. So if you go on a Spring Initializer, create a new project. So we're going to be using Maven, Java as programming language. We're going to be using Springboot 3.4.4 and give it a name. Leave packaging as jar. I will be using Java 21, and you need to add two dependencies. In this case, we need Spring Web and Lombok, and that's all we need. Click generate. This is going to download the file and then open it in an IDE. So we're going to start now implementing our actual code in this daily brief service, which, as I said, is our Springboot project running in Java. And I already showed you how to run this on your local machine, so this part should be good to go. We already have Mistral AI running inside Ollama on our local host, and we've also got our News API key. We are actually good to go, and we can start coding. I have opened the downloaded Springboot project in IntelliJ. What we need to do now is build a bunch of packages. So I'm going to start by building a controller package. This is the entry point to our program. In here, we're going to create a news brief controller. So this is going to be a REST controller, so we need to add the tag. And we are also going to add the request mapping. So this is the base mapping API/v1 news brief. Now we need to create our first endpoint. So we're going to create a public news summary response is going to be our response object, and we're going to call it general brief. And this general brief is actually going to call a news brief service. And inside this news brief service, we're going to create a method. So in this case, I decided to call it generate general news brief. We need to add a bunch of tags. So this is going to be a get endpoint. We are going to assign a value. In this case, it's going to be /general brief. And this is going to produce JSON. So this is the simple of the two endpoints I talked about earlier. So as you can see, we're going to have two endpoints. One is going to be the render one that is going to return HTML, and one is going to be the JSON one. So in this case, let's also create the other endpoint, but we're not going to fill it for now. So this is going to be general brief, but we're also going to have render, and this will be producing text HTML value. I wanted to create this so that you could see the difference between the two. So this is going to return JSON, and this is going to be the one returning HTML. And the difference is that this is a different endpoint that will return something as a HTML. The cool thing is that we can call this endpoint from within our browser, and it will be actually already rendered when we see the response. So I will comment it out for now, and let's focus on this method. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create a new package called service. And let's create a new class inside this new package, and we're going to call it news brief service. And this is going to be a service class, so we'll add the tag. Let's go back to our controller and let's inject it. We're going to have a news brief service, and then we want to inject it in the constructor, so we're going to be using auto-wired. This error is gone, but this is still red, so we need to create this method inside the news brief service. Let's go in here. By the way, let's also add SLF4J for some logging. It's going to make easier to debug in case there are issues. And in here, we're going to have a public news summary response. And this is going to be the generate general news brief. And as input, we are not going to take anything for now. But because we have two endpoints, we want to be able to use the same method to generate both HTML and JSON responses. I will show that in a bit. If we go back to our controller, this is not red anymore, but this is still red. We need to create this new summary response class. Let's create a new package, and this is going to be called DTO. DTO stands for Data Transfer Objects. We have a new summary response. Let's leave it blank for now, we'll fill it in later. And let's import it. There is an error here. New summary response, let's import. Let's see if the error is gone in the controller. All the errors are gone in the controller, and this is all we need for now. If we go back to our new service, this is where we want to concentrate now. The first thing we need to do is to get back the top headlines for today. And to do that, we need to query news API. We will be getting a news API response object. We will be creating a client, and this client will have a method called getTopHeadlines. So let's implement this news API client now. We'll need to inject it in the constructor. We will need to create a public constructor and inject it using auto-wired. Let's create this news client. We're going to create a new package. And in here, we're going to create a news API client. So we're going to use the service tag again, and also SLF4J. And now we need to create this method. So public news API response, get top headlines. As you can see, we don't have this object. That's why we got the error. So in our DTO, let's create also this class, news API response, and let's leave it blank for now. We'll see later what to put in here. And let's import. We need to now call news API. Let's go back to the news API documentation. If you go on the documentation, you can see that they've got different endpoints, and the one we're interested in is the top headlines. So this is the top headlines endpoint, which basically returns the top headlines for the country you specify. And you need to send the API key. In this case, it's sent as a query parameter. I'm quite sure, oh yeah, it says here, you can also send it in the HTTP header. And this is the name of the HTTP header, X API key you need to use. This is up to you, but for simplicity, we're going to be sending this as a query parameter in the get call. So this is the endpoint, and this is what we will be calling in our Spring Boot app. So let's go back to our code, and we need to add few things in application.properties. In here, we're going to add 4 new properties. So I'm just going to paste them here, but basically we'll need the news API key, and over here you need to paste your API key that we got earlier. So just put it here. I will delete it from here for now, just to make editing easier, but you will need to have your API key over here. Then we need the news API base URL. So in this case is this one, default country. So I'm just gonna go for US. And then you also need to define the actual endpoint. So in this case, we will be calling the top headlines endpoint in News API. We've got these properties. Let's go back to our News API client, and we need to import this property in variables over here. We're going to use the value tag, and this is going to be called News API key. So we'll save this as a string in our API key string variable. Then we're going to import the base URL, the default country, and the top headlines URL. Once we have these, we need to actually put these all together to get a single URL. So what we're going to do is have a private method called get top headlines URL. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually build this URL. To build this, we're going to be using a URI components builder. So as base, we're going to be using the base URL, and we're simply going to add two query parameters, the ones that we saw in the documentation. The first one is country, and the second one is the API key. Once we have this, we're going to transform this as a string and return it to the caller. And I've also added a log line just so that we can see what has been generated in the terminal. Let's complete our actual endpoint calls. So we're going to be using a REST template. Then we're going to be taking our URL from the getTopHeadlines URL method that we have just built down here. And now we're going to have a News API response. This is our external endpoint call result. So we're going to be using the REST template and get back the object from this URL. And we're going to put this in a News API response. Let's log the response we've got. And then we're simply going to return this result. Let's make this final. It makes the code a little bit more efficient and debugging easier in case there are issues. So now we need to see what we need to put in this News API response object. So the first thing is to add some Lombok annotations so we can generate the boilerplate code automatically. So let's add these ones. These are standard tags. Now we need to see how the response looks like. To do that, let's go back to the documentation. So as we can see, we get back three attributes at the top level. One is status, total results, and then a list of articles. So this is what our News API response should contain. We are not interested in status. Let's just save total results and the articles. We want to call them exactly like this. If we go back to our code, let's have a private int for total results and then a private list of articles. So here we'll have article, which is going to be a class we are going to create, and this is going to contain a list of articles. We need to create this article, and we're going to create it here in the DTO. And if we go in article, we now need to see what to put over here. So let's start with the standard annotations. And let's look at what we need. So if you go back to our documentation, we can see that this article returns a list of articles, but each one of these articles has a source object, which we're not really interested in. It has an author, title, description, a URL to the full news article, an image, the date of publication, and the content. So I would say let's just focus on the title, the description, and the content, and let's ignore the other attributes. This is also going to make our code simpler. So because we are ignoring some of the properties, we need to add the JSON ignore properties and do ignore unknown equals to true. And over here, we're just going to create attributes we're actually interested in saving. So title, description, and content. So now if we go back to our News API response, let's get rid of this error by importing. And now if we go back to our News API client, let's see if you're missing anything. We have one issue, and that is that we need to import in our service class these new classes we have created. And this is all we need to call the news API to get the top headlines. So if you go to news brief service, we can actually test if what we have written so far is working or not. Let's get this response and let's log it. And then to get rid of this error, we can simply just return a new summary response. Let's just create the tags so we can create a dummy response, but we'll still be able to see the logs. These do not exist yet. Actually, this is a good time to discuss the response we want to send back to the users. What we want to send back is probably the summary, and this is going to be a string, and the time this summary was created. So local date time, and let's call it created at I think this is all we need. This is going to be sufficient. In case we think we need something else, we can just add it later. So if you go back to our service, now we can create this dummy response. Up until here, we should still be able to get responses. So to test this, we can simply create a configuration, go in edit configuration, create a new one, application, and I'll call it news brief. Select the main class, click apply, OK, and let's run this. Let's enable this and let's see if there are any errors. So the application has started successfully. Now we need to actually call this endpoint to trigger the whole flow. So we need to call this endpoint over here, general brief, open Postman, create a new GET request, just click send. We get the dummy response, but if you go back to our logs, we can see that this is the URL that was called using this API key. And these are the articles that have been returned. So we got back 36 articles for today. And this is what we want to summarize. So we've seen that so far this is working. Let's move on to the next step. So we've got our news articles back in our news service. The next step is to actually use our locally running LLM to summarize these articles. We've already got the log line, so requesting summary, and then we'll get the number of articles. Over here, we're actually going to get back responses from Ollama, so I'll call it Ollama response. And then we're going to have an Ollama client that is going to generate the summary for us using these news articles. We don't need anything else for now. Let's add this Ollama client in our constructor. So we're going to inject this. And let's create the actual client. So it's going to be called Ollama client. And this is going to be a service class, and this is going to also have some logging. Let's go back to the service and let's import this so we can get rid of this error. The next thing is also this Ollama response. So this is going to be another DTO. And let's also already fill this. Let's have data, no args constructor, all args constructor. Let's have a builder. And also let's have a JSON ignore properties. So you can go in the documentation, or you can simply just do a local test. You can call your locally running Ollama instance. Actually, let me just quickly show you. So this is the endpoint we need to call in Ollama to get a response from a LLM running inside Ollama. So this is the endpoint, and as you can see, this is the port I showed you earlier, 11434. We need to specify the model, the prompt, and also if we want it streamed or not. Streamed is returning each token at a time. This is optional, by the way. If your AI model is running on locally, you can also simply test it using Postman. I just want to show you how this looks like. I've sent the request. Let's see what we get back. So this is how the response looks like. We've got various attributes, but really what we are interested at is the response. Maybe if it's done or not. The rest we can simply ignore. We've got some more attributes. If you're interested, please feel free to stop and have a look. Let's go back to our Ollama response object, and let's have a string that is going to be the response and the boolean that is going to contain the done status. So let's start building our Ollama client. If we go in application.properties, this is going to be very similar to what we did for the news API. So we are going to have a base URL, which is the one I just showed you on Postman. And then also let's define the model name, as this was one of the parameters. We need to now import these as values inside the client itself. We're going to have the Ollama API URL. I'll just call it Ollama URL Mistral model. By the way, I'm using GitHub Copilot. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not that good. So AI model. So as you can see, it actually imported the wrong value import. So we don't want the Lombok one. We want the actual Spring framework beans.factory.annotation.value. Otherwise, this is not going to work. And I have spent quite some time in trying to debug this error, and it was just a wrong import. So don't make the same mistake. And over here, we're going to actually create the actual method that is going to generate the summary given the list of articles. Let's import so that these errors are gone. And now here, as you saw, this is going to be a post request. So let's create the REST template, and let's also create the actual prompt. So this is where things might get a bit more interesting. We're going to create a private method to generate this prompt. Because we've got a list of articles and we want to summarize them, we need to send them to our AI model and get a summary back for this whole bunch of articles. And to do that, let's create a private method called getPrompt. This is going to get a list of articles. This is where we build the actual prompt. So I'm going to be using a string builder because we need to add a bunch of stuff. Prompt builder. We need to give the AI some context. This is what worked for me. You can write your own prompt if you want, but I decided to go for this one. Feel free to pause the video and have a read through this prompt. And now for each article, we want to add a bunch of things to our prompt. So prompt builder.append. We want to append the title. So we'll get the title from the article. We'll get the description, and then we'll also say end of article, just so that it's easier for our AI model to actually know that the article has ended and another one has started. If you find a better way, please leave it in the comment box below. And then we're going to build a string, the actual prompt, using this whole string we have built over here, and we'll simply return it. And this is how we build our prompt. The next thing is to create the actual post request. So we're going to create a Ollama request object, and this is going to have the request payload. So we need to define these properties in this Ollama request object, which we need to create in our DTOs. So let's add our usual tags. And let's add the properties we need to send in our post request. So we need the model. We need the actual prompt. and we need to define whether it's a stream or not. So if you go back to our Ollama client, let's import this, and the error is gone. So this will be deserialized as a JSON, and we'll have the JSON payload to send to our endpoint. So the next thing is to create our HTTP entity, and this is going to contain the Ollama request, and we need to get this HTTP entity from this request payload. I think this is not that interesting. This is like a typical HTTP entity creation, so I'm just going to paste the method, but I've created a separate method that is going to get this Ollama request, set the header's content type to application.json, and then it's going to create an entity using this request payload, and it's going to add this header over here. So now that we've got our request entity, we can simply get our REST template and make the actual call. So response entity is going to return an Ollama response, and we're going to use the REST template to do a post call to the Ollama URL using this HTTP entity, and this is where the response is going to get deserialized in Ollama response. Let's log this, and then let's return the response body, which is going to be simply our Ollama response. So now let's go back to our news brief service. Let's import the Ollama response, and we can now simply build our actual news summary response. So created that, we're simply going to be using the local.datetime.now method. And the summary is actually going to be the Ollama response.getResponse. So this is going to be the whole news summarized in a single string, and we're going to return this to the user. Let's rerun this. I am missing something, I believe. Let's see, Ollama client. Okay, so it looks like there is an error in the API URL in the value. So let's just check our application properties. Yeah, exactly. So I rely too much on Copilot. The names are different, so we need to actually fix this. The value should be ollama.base URL and not ollama.api.url. So let's try again. As you can see, it has started successfully. Let's open Postman and let's do a new call to our general brief endpoint. So if I click send, this is going to take some time because we're getting the news from News API, and probably the request is now already gone to our local LLM. And because there are quite a lot of articles and the AI model is running on my local machine, which by the way is a MacBook, and it's running an M3 chip. I don't have a specific GPU just for AI models. It is going to be a bit slow if you're in the same situation. If you've got a better and a dedicated GPU, probably you're going to get faster responses. Let's quickly take a look at the logs on Springboot. So as you can see, we've got the articles from News API, and we send the request to Ollama, and these are with our LLM. If you go in the terminal window where Ollama is running, you can actually see incoming requests inside Ollama and how long they took. So in this case, 1 minute 34 seconds. Here we go. We've got back our response. This is supposed to be the summary of the main articles from today. As you can see, it looks quite good to me. It even added numbers. We've got 17 headlines to read for today. So far we have built this flow. We have built almost everything. The only thing that is missing is this HTML response. So I thought this would be a nice addition and is going to make our project a bit more fun because we're actually getting HTML code generated by our AI model, and then we'll display this HTML code as an actual web page in our web browser. So let's go and implement our second endpoint to give back HTML responses. So let's go back to our code and implement the second endpoint. Let's go back to our controller and let's uncomment this. As you can see, we already have a second endpoint we created initially that is going to render the response as HTML. Let's give it a different name to the actual method. So I'm going to call it general brief UI. And I want to try and reuse as much code as possible of what we have already written. So we're going to be calling the same general news brief, but now we want to be able to tell this code that, hey, look, we want HTML code. And for that, we're going to be passing a flag. In this case, it's true, and this is false. It might not be clear now, but if you go inside the news brief service, we are actually going to start accepting a boolean called isRender. If it's the render endpoint, this is going to be true, otherwise it's going to be false. This attribute matters when we're asking Ollama to generate a summary. So we want to send this to the Ollama client, so we need to accept it also here. So boolean isRender. And then we want to do things differently if this is a render request. So how do we want to do things differently? The only difference is going to be the prompt we're going to be generating. So let's also pass this isRender endpoint to the private getPrompt method. So we're going to accept a boolean, which is going to be isRender. And then simply we want to have a different prompt if it's a render request. Otherwise, we're going to be using this other prompt we already have. So we're going to have an if, and this if is going to be simply checking if this is true. We're going to ask our AI model to generate HTML. Otherwise, it's going to generate a simple summary of the news articles. So this is the only difference in this part of the code. We need to do a couple of other things in the controller and then we should be good to go. Let's save this in actual object. This is going to be our news summary response. News summary response. We need to do something that is not that nice, but if you look at the response that we're going to get from Mistral AI, it's actually going to add some markdown. And this markdown text is actually the code box you see usually on ChatGPT or on other AI models, just so it's more readable. We want to get rid of it. I just came up with this simple substring. You can go ahead, and I think it would be really nice if you could do this using a regular expression. And if you do that, please leave it in the comment box below so that other people can use it as well. So we're simply going to subtract the first 7 characters and the last 3. And then we're going to actually return a response entity. And we're going to return a status code, in this case, OK, and content type. As I said, this is media type.html, and the body is going to be our HTML content that we have stripped off of the markdown that the AI model generated. And this is erroring because here, instead of a news summary response, we want to return a response entity, and this is going to be a string. This should now work. Let's run this. So simply open a new browser page and call this endpoint newsbrief/generalbrief/render. And this is going to send the request to our Springboot app. As I said before, this is going to take some time because the AI model is running locally, and depending on how powerful your machine is, this is going to take some time. If we go to the logs in the meantime, we can see that we've sent the request to our local AI. I also want to check something. This method is quite nice for caching. So this method is called by both the render endpoint and the non-render endpoint. We are actually doing a redundant call over here when we are getting the articles from News API. Because we're getting today's top headlines, they're not going to be changing every minute or every 10 minutes. They're going to be pretty much the same for some time. So this is a really good point to add some caching. So in the meantime, we can see that we have some HTML code generated, and as you can see, it looks quite good over here. This is the rendered page of today's headlines. So one thing is that every time you're going to generate this, it's going to look a bit different, and that's just the way AI works. So for example, if we recall this endpoint, again, this would really benefit from some caching. Let's see what's happening. So we've got the articles back. We've sent the request for summary for these articles to our AI model. So we are now waiting for a response from our AI model. So this is still loading. What's happening? Yeah, we're still waiting for a response for a summary. This is taking some time. We can see, yeah, the response just got served now. Here we got the response. It looks a bit different this time. As you can see, we've got also a title, news headlines. It looks a bit nicer. I saw some links, but it doesn't let me click here. But as you can see, here we've got a HTML code generated by AI, and we are able to show news summaries on a HTML page directly. The last thing I want to show you, I think it would be cool to add some kind of caching at least, because as you noticed, I called this endpoint and I had to wait again, even though the response is pretty much similar. The news headlines are not going to change. Let's use some caching to improve performance. To do this, we're going to be actually using Caffeine Cache, which is a fast in-memory cache, which is supported by Springboot. So we need to add a couple of dependencies. If you go to the pom.xml, we need these two new dependencies, Caffeine and Springboot Starter Cache. Let's import them. And now we need to enable caching on our application level. So we're going to be using enable caching tag on our main application class. So once we've got this, we can simply go on our service class and we can add this cacheable value. This is the name of the cache, news brief cache in this case. And the key is going to be the actual method name. Last thing, let's add some configuration for this cache. So I'm going to create a new config package, and I'm going to create a cache config bean. This is going to be configuration, and you're going to create a simple bean, public cache manager. This looks good. Let's import. As you can see, Copilot was quite useful here. We created a cache manager for the cache we're using. So we're using Caffeine Cache, that's how it's called, and I've decided to expire it after write after 2 minutes. So once this cache entry gets created, the eviction time is 2 minutes, and you can set a maximum size if you want. This is optional. I don't think we really need this. So I'm just going to remove it. And if we restart, if we call any endpoint, this should be a bit quicker. Actually, it should be way quicker because it should be cached. So the first time is going to be slow as before, but the second time around, we should just get a response back from our cache. Another good thing having this service method cached is that you won't run out of News API quota. Most of external APIs, they have certain quota, and in this case doesn't make sense if you got, let's say, thousands of requests a second. you don't want to spend money, because these requests at the end of the day in an actual production system, they do cost money. You want to reduce the requests to the external API to only when they're actually needed. So we're still waiting for our summary. Okay, we've got a request back. Let's try to send another request. So this one took 2 minutes and 48 seconds, which is quite slow. So if we send another one, as you can see, the second request just took 18 milliseconds, which is a huge difference. And another thing I want you to notice is that because we added this created at attribute, this time is the actual time this summary was created at. So if you keep sending, this is still going to be the same because this is saved in cache. And we have actually improved the performance of our application by quite a lot. So let's say someone else wanted this brief. They can call and they will not have to wait 2 minutes. You can also actually extend this cache and add cache population on startup. You can go and check out the post construct annotation, which is going to allow you to do something like that. And I think that's going to be a really nice addition. This cache should expire after 2 minutes. A request after 2 minutes is again going to take longer, but I think this is great, and we've got our summary. I think this is a really nice addition. It didn't take us long, and it was quite simple to implement. And with this, we have finished the implementation of our daily news brief service. We have built a service that gets the top headlines for today and uses a locally running LLM to generate a summary. This summary can be either JSON or a HTML page response. You might be wondering what to do next. So this was supposed to be a portfolio project idea to get you started with something and to fill up your GitHub portfolio for when you're actually sending job applications. But there are few additions that I've discussed throughout the video that you can add to this system. One of them is better caching, so you can add cache population on a startup. The second one is to have your Springboot application calling different models inside Olama depending on the need. So for example, when you want to generate HTML page, call DeepSeek Coder with the summary that you got from Mistral AI, for example. And again, you can add more caching over there as well. If you've ever wondered how I keep my coding skills sharp all year round, then let me introduce you to Brilliant. Brilliant helps you get smarter every day with thousands of interactive lessons in math, science, programming, data analysis, and AI. It's hands-on learning that actually sticks. Instead of passively watching videos, you're solving fun, bite-sized problems that train you to think like a real programmer. Whether you're learning a foundation or brushing up on advanced concepts, Brilliant makes it easy to learn anywhere, anytime with their mobile application. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for 30 days, visit brilliant.org/LeetJourney or scan the QR code on screen. You will also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Huge thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video.